Inflation. We've had some low inflation years, but you can have high inflation. Just think back to the 70s and the early 80s. Unpredictable expenses. And the interest rates at annuitization. We'll show you an example of how those can really fluctuate and affect people. Now, Social Security does provide some protection. And as Lane mentioned, some private pension plans historically did provide partial inflation protection, but that's in the past. Usually, ad hoc increases. Most private plans are not doing it today. Very few are. So who bears the risks? And there are different risks. The investment return, pre-retirement, pre and post. To the extent the employee takes an annuity, the employer bears the risks in a DB plan, both pre and post-retirement. In a DC plan, the employee bears all the risk. To the extent that the employee takes a lump sum, the employee is taking the investment risk post-retirement. Retirement age in a DC environment, the employee, the longer they work, the bigger the pool of money, and the more it will last. In the DB world, depending on the plan design, it could be the employer or the employee. People outliving the mortality table. And we all know some people who have lived beyond the expectations, people well into the 90s or maybe celebrated the centennial year. In the DB world, the employer is pooling that risk. In the DC world, it's self-insured. And that can lead to some very difficult times at superannuation. The unpredictable expenses, well, that the employee has to save for through personal savings. High inflation, pre-retirement. Most DB plans are indexed in some fashion for inflation pre-retirement, whether it's based on salaries or inflation or periodic updates. Post-retirement, it's the individual. The DC world, it's the individual throughout. Other risks that people face are loss of a spouse, taking care of others, which may mean that they can't earn anything on the side. Timing of retirement. Sometimes the timing is not voluntary, it's involuntary. The cost of long-term care. Plan design changes late in the career. Employer bankruptcy, especially if the benefits are in excess of the PBGC guarantees. The risks exist regardless of the pension plan vehicle. Public policy supports both types of vehicles to have some type of diversification of risk. In retirement, people try to work, but some people just, depending on the nature of the job, some jobs just don't lend themselves to working as long as other jobs. It's not one size fits all. And public policy has to be flexible in dealing with different types of employment and different retirement ages. Depending on plan design, as far as inflation risk, if you have a frozen plan, the employees have all the inflation risk. So what are some of the investment risks? And this one is very critical because everybody thinks in terms of the expected return on plan assets. Well, I can tell you one thing, whatever you're expecting to earn on the plan assets for the year, unless it's in a guaranteed vehicle, I'll guarantee you one thing, the answer will be different. It might be higher, it might be lower, but none of us have perfect crystal balls. And that's a problem for retirees and near retirees, because what happens if the market goes south, it tanks just around retirement? Everybody says, well, long term, the market will bounce back up eventually. But the retiree has to spend the money. And as they spend down from the dissipated assets, they're drawing down the small pool. And when the market finally rebounds, there's nothing left to rebound. So the timing of the market cycle can be devastating to someone if it's just at retirement for a negative cycle. You just don't have time to make up the losses. And things do fluctuate. Results are volatile, as we've seen over the past decade, and even in the previous, even in the market upcycle, 17 and a half years, but we still had October 1987 where the stock market dropped about 20 to 33% within a single month. So everybody says that over the cycle, everything balances out. This slide is trying to say that maybe not quite. Maybe it takes a lot longer than we ever anticipated. Over time, the average rate of return tends to coalesce towards a single number. The total return over the period of time tends to get ever further and further apart. And that's what a lot of people don't focus in on, that if you compound it, it gets further and further apart. We ran these numbers on what they call like a Monte Carlo simulation stochastic model where it does all the what ifs. We run thousands and thousands of economic scenarios over time. And over time, if you start with a pool of money in day one and invest it and look at all the different possible outcomes with the probabilities, at the 95th percentile, the top 5%, the results after 30 years are 4 times better than the bottom 5%. That's 1 in 20. Well, 1 in 20s do occur. I think we said that we had about once in a century is twice this past decade, so 1 in 20s are not that rare. And in fact, if you look at the 20th century, real rates of return in the U.S. equity markets from 1900 to 1950 compared with 1950 to 2000. 1950 to 2000, real rates of return in the equity markets in this country were 3% per year compounded, greater than in the first half of the century. That means if you took money and invested it in the market in 1900 and look at what it grew to in 1950 in real dollars, and did the same 1950 to 2000. 1950 to 2000 produced 4 times as much money at the end as 1900 to 1950. And that's a long cycle. Most of us don't have 50 years to wait out a cycle, and 50 years didn't even balance out in this past century. So how can the timing risk be quantified in more realistic terms, more concrete terms? Let's take an example. We have somebody who is ready to retire at age 65, January 1, 2008, and has $1 million in his account. And we also have a 64-year-old working at the next desk, also has $1 million in his account. And just to keep the example simple, we're assuming no contributions during 2008 for the 64-year-old, and the 64-year-old doesn't take anything out. The 65-year-old says, fine, I'm retiring January 1, 2008, Happy New Year, and takes his $1 million, which had been invested in a typical 60-40 portfolio, 60% equities, the S&P 500, 40% bonds in the Lehman aggregate, now called Barclays, and went out and bought an annuity from XYZ Humongous Insurance Company and got about $93,000 per year for the rest of his life or her life. The 64-year-old waited a year, wanted to wait till 65, and then went out and took his or her money. But something happened during 2008. The markets weren't very pretty, and the market went down. So the $1 million was a little under $800,000. And at the same time, interest rates went down, so annuity purchase rates went up. It cost more to buy the annuity. At the end of the day, when he went to Humongous Insurance Company to buy an annuity with what had been $1 million a year earlier, he or she only got $68,700, a 26% reduction in the annual check or monthly check for every year for the rest of their life, because they waited 1 year to cash out of the market and buy an annuity. That's how much the timing can affect the answer. As we said before, a lot of people underestimate their longevity. And people are living longer and longer. All the advances in medicine. I mean, I heard just on the radio going to the airport yesterday about a new type of heart valve surgery that avoids open heart surgery. They do it by just some type of feeding it through a one of the blood vessels, and they can replace the aortic valve. More and more new medical techniques are coming on board, and people live longer. So if you have a 65-year-old average person, we took the average white collar, blue collar, male, female, the whole thing. We looked at the males and we looked at the females. 65-year-old in 2010. One chance in 11 that they'll make it to 95. One chance for male, one chance in 6 for female. 20 years from now, the projection is, instead of one chance in 11, it'll be one chance in 7. Instead of 9% making it to 95, 13% will be making it to 95. Almost 50%, 40 to 50% more people will celebrate their 95th birthday among the males if they turn 65 20 years later. Females going from 17 to 20. Across all age brackets, people are living longer, and we have to allow for additional income to cover that.